by Andy Beckstoffer, your office there in George III Vineyard. Thanks so much for your time today. We've put together these seminars with the goal of, trying to find a way to bring us all together in this time, which is a very complicated time, obviously, and to sort of foster a spirit of togetherness. And sort of before we get into we're talking about these wines and these great vineyards and history of which you could teach us all forever. I was sort of joking with Andy before we went on camera that every time I go to your office, I feel like I'm going to the principal's office. Like, oh my God, I'm in trouble. I'm going to get scolded for something. I surely did something wrong. But anyway, you've always been very gracious. Thank you. You helped us a lot with the maps, which we'll show in a bit. But tell us a little bit what you're seeing out there in terms of what the mood is like and what the atmosphere is like for those of us who are obviously far away.
Well, it's springtime here, and we had bud break maybe 3 weeks ago. So it's beautiful here. I mean, I think the temperature is about 75 degrees today, and there's all these young flowering plants. We had a little bit of frost in Canaris, but not too much. We haven't had near the rain we want. But if you look at it just on that basis, it's a wonderful time right now. It's a wonderful time right now, but it's kind of hard to have any fun when so many people are dying all over the world. So that there's this pall, if you would, over everything. But it's a very normal, dry season here, and it's a beautiful time. It's just a beautiful time.
But obviously all the hotels are closed and the restaurants are closed, so that's got to feel pretty weird.
That's true. It does feel weird, but Antonio, I go back to the time in the 2015 when we had the big fires in Lake County. It's amazing how people came together, helping each other, calling each other. I mean, I've had guys who I haven't seen for 10 years call, hey, how are you? How's the family? And people are just friendly. What can I do to help? And we're all going to the restaurants and doing takeout. So it's a friendly place. I mean, there's lots of people who have lots of trouble. I mean, I think you know about this donation we've made, and boy, there's lots and lots of people who are out of work, but everybody's helping a little bit, and everybody's very appreciative of it. This isn't the first problem we've had. We had phylloxera, we've had everything. This is probably bigger because people are dying, but we'll make it through.
Yeah, I've always seen a spirit of togetherness in Napa Valley, even among all the different people in the industry, even in much better times. And for sure, I mean, you guys have had, you mentioned that 2015, but I think it was 14 that it was an earthquake, and 17, obviously there were the fires and the mudslide and all the rain before, in like January time. Then obviously the fires. Last year during harvest, the power was going out. You're probably, I imagine people are pretty used to dealing with some level of crisis, although this is obviously on a pretty unprecedented scale.
Yeah, it's farming. We have problems with that stuff all the time. What we haven't had here, either in Lake County or here, we've had a major fire every year since 2015. It's something we've never had before. And this, again, is something we've never had before. It's a different scope, if you would. But that's what farming's about. I mean, when we have a year that's really smooth, that's abnormal.
Yeah, no, that's a great point of view to have. So you and your company, I mean, you farm, I think the last figure I saw was something like 3,600 acres of vineyards, but the crown jewels are some of the most highly regarded vineyards in Napa Valley. You've been at this for over 50 years, which you don't look like that at all. So good genes. But tell us share with us some of your history. I mean, we had Kathy Corson on a couple of days ago, and she was telling us that when she got to Napa Valley, there were 30 wineries, but you were predate her by about a decade. So how did this all happen? How did you get to Napa Valley in the first place?
Well, after I got out of the Amos Tuck School at Dartmouth with an MBA,
which I didn't get into, by the way.
They're a little selective sometimes, but sometimes some of them slip in. Even a blind hog got an acorn every now and then. I lucked in. I got in. I lucked in.
I did not. It's okay.
So, but I went to work for Hubline, and they hadn't seen an MBA before and anything like that. And they didn't do any long range planning. So I said we should do some long range planning. So So we started that, and then somebody said we needed to look at the domestic wine business. So the chairman said, Andy, we don't know what to do with you here. Why don't you go to California and see what that's like? So we went out there and we did lots of studies, and we came up with the fact that two things were important. One, we had to get the right grapes because of the great grape fluctuations. And two, we had to get it in the premium dry wine business. Now, that was 1968. In 1967 was the first year in the United States that dry table wine sold more than sweet wine. We're just beginning that transfer. But we looked at all the things and we said we'd like to get in this if we could get in the premium dry wine business. And in those days, there were only two substantial premium dry wine businesses. One was Parmesan and one was Almaden. And we had the feeling that we could do better than that. And in the Napa Valley. And so that we bought the taste was Colony, which we thought was about the same size as Gallo. But they also had this thing called Inglenook, which was a premium dry wine business. And in those days, there were only 6 important wineries in the Napa Valley: Inglenook and Beaulieu, and Beringers and Krug, Christian Brothers, and Martini. So we had the opportunity to buy one of those, if you would, and then expand it. So we did that, and then right after that, we got the opportunity to do at Beaulieu Vineyard. So I wanted to come out and work in the wine business. I'd been traveling all the time. So I came out to get in the dry wine business, and the guy out here said, come out and I'll teach you the marketing business. I was an engineer and a finance guy. But before that could happen, we found out we didn't have enough grapes. And the company didn't want to get in the real estate business owning vineyards. So I would go around the country and talk to people on the 38th floor of the Chase Manhattan building about the economics of prime varietal vineyards. And they would say, yeah, we want to invest, but who's going to farm? So we were forced to set up a farming company. As soon as we set up that farming company, the corporation was hit with a boycott from Cesar Chavez United Farm Workers. So they said, you've got to control that business. We got to get there. So I was asked to form and be the president of something called the Vinifera Development Corporation, which was a farming company. And in 1970, we were farming over 3,000 acres of vines in Napa Valley. It was about 12% of the whole Napa Valley. We were big farmers. And we farmed for Inglenook and we farmed for Beaulieu and we bought new vineyards. So we took over all of that farming. And then by 1973 or 74, but let's say 72, 73, they figured they had all the Cabernet they wanted. And they were both Cabernet brands, so we were very oriented to Cabernet with Andre. They figured they had what they wanted, and they wanted to sell the company because it didn't fit with a big Eastern marketing company. But it was a not-for-profit company. We would farm for you at cost if you would sell us grapes at market. So the company made no money, and our only clients were those guys who said, I'll invest if you'll farm. So we couldn't sell it. And then I had been running a small farming company for a large Eastern marketing company. So there really wasn't any spot for me in the corporation. So I'll never forget one night at the bar at the Clift Hotel, which is where people went in those days. I told the chairman, let's kill 2 birds with 1 stone. You can't find me a job and you can't sell the company. Well, I'm getting money, but you sell me the company and you solve both problems. So he did. And that's how it all got started.
And that was late 70s.
That was 1973.
73, sorry.
Yeah, 1973.
So that's the beginning of Beckstoffer Vineyards.
And well, that was the start of the Vinifera Development Corporation.
Okay, got it.
But let me tell you that, just to make sure you know, we borrowed all the money at 6%, which was prime. By 1976, 77, prime was 18%. Wow. So then in 1978, we did what we call recapitalize. They took back all the vineyards, basically. And then I got to keep the farming company with, I think we went from $7 million in debt to $2 million in debt. And we started again in 78 as Beckstoffer Vineyards. And that's when that started. And it was, remember, we weren't real estate people, we were farmers. We had set up a professional farm management company here. And so I think we bought our first new vineyard in 1981. So it took us 3 years to get on our feet to start buying vineyards.
Okay. And then what? And then what's the next And then what happens?
Well, we started buying vineyards, and every time, what we would do, we would buy a vineyard and we would get seller financing. In other words, if I bought it from you, I'd give you 10% down and you'd finance 90%. But the Production Credit Association, which I was a board member, would lend me the 10% with the second deed of trust.
Okay.
And then, Jesus, this is why I won't let you in the office, because you ask these embarrassing questions.
No, these are great questions. It shows incredible daring. I mean, basically, you borrowed the whole thing.
Or the whole thing, and then the equity in that one vineyard would grow. So we would put that together with a new vineyard, borrow the equity out of the old vineyard to finance the second vineyard, and then do it again with seller financing with the Production Credit Association, Farm Credit, lending us the money to develop it. But that's how we kept on going. But remember, we had farmed 3,000 acres in the Napa Valley. We farmed next to everything. So we know where the good stuff was. And we also had this Cabernet Sauvignon orientation from the very beginning, because both Inglenook and Beaulieu were Cabernet Sauvignon people. And my first viticulturist was a guy named Andrei Chelichev.
Yeah, a guy named Andrei Chelichev was one of the most legendary winemakers in Napa Valley, obviously.
He is. And then we brought a young guy in called Bob Steinhauer, who ended up running all of Barringer's vineyards all over the world, to put a young scientist with the old guy. And so that's how we began to farm, and how we began to know what these properties were. And so the thing to understand the story, it was back in those days is when the best wines were reserves. So people thought that the major ingredient was the winemaker. We call him the magic chef. And you bring me whatever you have, all your vineyards and things, and I will make this soup, which is the way you make great wine. We thought differently. We thought that the vineyards were the most important ingredient. So we would find these vineyards that had been in vines for 150 years, been planted in the 19th century. And we would go to buy them, but we didn't have any competition because the wineries didn't think they were very important. If we had any competition, we, this little farmer who's leveraging everything he has, would never have been able to buy any of it. But we were able to buy that. It started with Los Piedras and went on and on and on. But every time we would pay more than anybody else would. It seems ridiculous. We would pay $30,000 an acre for something, and oh my God. But the wineries wouldn't compete. We were able to buy when Beaulieu or Heublein wanted to sell their BV number 4, which is Coquelin. Robert Madavi, who was next door, wouldn't pay the money, so we get to buy it. But that's how those things begin to happen over and over again with all of these, what we call the heritage vineyards, of which we have 6, and you know their names, Coquelin and Dr. Crane and Los Piedras and Bourne and Vineyard George III, which had been BV number 3, and Missouri Hopper, plus other vineyards here and in Mendocino County. And I have to tell you, in the 80s, the Chardonnay from Mendocino County is what carried this company for sure. For sure.
Really? That's interesting. And here's a picture of you with Andre.
Yeah, you can tell which one is which, can't you?
Which is a great shot. It's a fantastic memory. So while we're going to put up some images and take a look at these maps, but one of the things that we'd like to encourage is to get as many questions as possible while we're talking, so we don't get all the questions at the end. I forgot to mention that at the beginning, but the more interactive we can make this, the better, I think. So if you've got questions, don't feel like you got to wait to the end, just fire them away, and Andy and I will answer them. Mostly Andy will answer them. But yeah, this is a great shot. Do you remember where this was?
Yes, that's it was BV number 3, or which we call Vineyard George III. And this was a crucial time because in those days, everybody was diversifying in the vineyards with the Bordeaux 5. In other words, Cabernet, Cabernet Franc, Petit Verdot, Malbec, and Merlot. And we went with Andre, and Andre said, you need to diversify in the vineyard. That's where we are. He said, but don't diversify with clones of Cabernet. And that's what we did. And it was great advice, because what really grew well there was Cabernet, and we didn't need to blend that off with Merlot or Petit Verdot or anything else. But this would have been sometime in the 70s in Rutherford, at Vineyard George III, which had been BV number 3.
Right. And so, okay. And so that's George III, which is where your office is, correct?
Yes, that's where we are now.
And that's a pretty large vineyard.
It is. It is.
Was it all one purchase or was it done over time?
No, this is a combination of 4 different vineyards. Most of it always was BV number 3, but we added 2 other vineyards to it. But the vineyard is about 260, 270 acres of vineyard. And about 40 acres of that is cult stuff. It's what you see in the vineyard designate wines. The other is very, very good Cabernet. But when you go to the vineyard designate cult wines, it really takes a special place.
Yeah, and so we're down here, if you can see my mouse, down here in the city of Rutherford.
Yes.
So about 40%, 40 acres, I'm sorry. Correct me if I'm wrong. Did you say 40% or 40 acres of the?
40 acres.
40 acres is what gets bottled as some as the higher end wines, and the rest goes into blends and such, correct?
Yeah, or Napa Valley Cabernets.
Or Napa Valley, I mean, that's what I mean.
A lot of very nice Napa Valley Cabernet that grows here, but if you see Vineyard George III on the bottle of G3, it comes from that 40 acres.
And is that 40 acres in one, are those 40 acres sort of close together and contiguous, or are they more spread out across the property?
They're pretty contiguous. They're about where that yellow sign is there, and you see the diagonal lines. I can't show
right
them.
Here.
Right in there. It's in there, and then it's a little bit to the right of that, primarily.
Down here.
To the right, not down. That's to the bottom, to the right.
Yeah.
And then up on the other side of the reservoir, there's a knoll that is really beautiful land.
All right.
About halfway between the reservoir and Silverado Trail.
Okay. So that's what you consider what distinguishes those parts of the vineyard, because they're a little bit spread apart? So is it the soil, or is it some combination of the clones there that give you think slightly better or better fruit?
I think you start with the soil, because we can change the clones as we want. And remember, we've been farming this land. We farmed it for Beaulieu in 1970, so we've been farming this land for 50 years. So we know where the good spots are, but the climate is basically the same. But it happens that the soils, as they go down to Con Creek, which is right along there, and then on that knoll is where the gravel is the highest content, and where the grapes have traditionally been the best. But Antonio, the thing with this vineyard and with all vineyards, great vineyards produce great wines. I don't care what the soil is, the climate. If they don't produce great wines, they're not great vineyards. But we have found over the years, going even back to Beaulieu, where the best grapes came from and the best wines came from. And that's how we pick these spots. They are a bit different in terms of their soil content. Yeah,
I mean, it's interesting. I think that I know that the first great older Napa Valley wine that I had was George Latour from the mid 70s. I think it was 75, I'm pretty sure. But I'd had younger wines, but the first wine that I tasted that was an older wine that made me sort of understand how these wines age was the mid 70s George Latour, around like the year 2000. So it was 25 years old. And I was just blown away by its depth, power, complexity. And that wine really changed my whole life in thinking about these wines and trying to understand where they're from. And of course, how they age, because those wines age spectacularly well.
Yeah.
So that's Rutherford. And then you mentioned Las Piedras, which is in St. Helena. So how did that happen?
Well, Las Piedras, and these are, again, heritage wine. Las Piedras was first planted in 1840 by Edward Bale. And Las Piedras was owned by Ernie Van Asperen of Ernie's Liquor Stores. I don't remember Ernie very well. And Ernie wanted to buy a second yacht. And we had been friends socially, and I was the only one who was paying $30,000 an acre for land. And so he decided to sell it to me. And it was such a rock pile, I'm not sure if other people would have bought it anyway. It's up on the hills in St. Helena. So we bought it from Ernie. And Ernie, when I take Europeans, they'll love it because there's so many cobbles in it. And we called it Beckstoffer 4 originally but the farm workers called it Las Piedras because there's so many pebbles. And Ernie had to plant the vines with sticks of dynamite. We could do a little bit better because he loosened the soil up, but it's a very rocky site. It's one of the first sites to come on every year. It gets ripe earliest, but it's on the west side of St. Helena.
Yeah, we're going to show that in a second. Does it get riper because the rocks transmit heat to the vines and the fruit? Is that the theory?
In the Napa Valley, different than most places, it's warmer in the north than it is in the south because of the influences of the bay.
Right.
So here we are, we're up probably, in my view, the upper reaches of premium Cabernet land. My view is Calistoga is too hot. That's just personal with me. But once you get up in the upper reaches of St. Helena, you're as warm as you want to get. So here it's very warm and the soils are very thrifty. So the soils warm up very fast and thus the grapes come on very fast. I was out in the vineyards on Sunday, both here and at Dr. Crane, which is just up the street.
Yeah.
And they're farther than anything else. But it's a warmer, area than anything in Oakville.
Yeah, for sure. So here's Las Piedras here, and that vineyard is small, but it's very complex, and it has a lot of different sections in that tiny little vineyard. It's really cool.
It does, and it's right on Dry Creek, and so you can see all the pebbles in the creek, and I'm sure at one point the water was all over this vineyard as well. Yeah,
there's a lot of really cool wines that come out of there. You sent me one, which is a Benoit Touquette's wine from Fatman, which is beautiful. But there's also, I think, as I recall, I'm pretty sure, my memory's still pretty good, Mark Carter makes 2 wines from that vineyard.
Mark Carter makes wine from there, and Schrader makes wine from there. And
Mark makes 2. He makes 2 different bottlings.
Yeah.
And yeah, Schrader, of course.
Hobbs is in there. There's about 10 different wineries in there.
Yeah, that wine always has a really dark character, and a lot of structure, a lot of tannin. It's always a wine from St. Helena that I like a lot. So that's here, and then you can see the neighborhood here and who's around. And then what about Dr. Crane?
Dr. Crane is right down from that, and Dr. Crane, that was in the hands of a guy who was going to put a resort on it. A hotel on it, and he had bought it from 2 old Italian farmers, and it had always produced some of the best black fruit in the Napa Valley, and it was generally bottled and sold at auction for the St. Helena High School, I think. And so I bought it in lieu of foreclosure. In other words, the sellers who weren't getting paid by the developers sold it for me rather than foreclose on him. And the city fathers who were sort of involved with this thing said, we'll sell it to you if you'll build a community center there. And I said, I will. I'll give you 3 acres to build a community center. They didn't, but thank God. But this had been, most of these other vineyards had been in grapes since the 1800s. This vineyard in the 1930s was Chinatown. And in most cities in California, they had a Chinese population. They built the railroads, they did the mines, they built the stone wineries around here. So we bought that, I think, in about 1990, but it's in the same basic microclimate, if you will, as the Bourne Vineyard, which is just down from that, and Las Piedras. Very rocky soils. It in fact is the first of the premium vineyards that we pick every year.
So one of the things about the wines from Dr. Crane is that they often have a really floral quality and a really red fruit quality. I know there's a lot of 337 there, but clone Cabernet. But do you think it's a more about the soil or what's actually planted there? Because there's always a commonality in that vineyard.
Well, that vineyard is planted to 337 and clone 4, and I think there's a little clone 6 in there. Again, the idea when we started to go to vineyard, when I first started talking about doing vineyard designate, I remember we had a press conference, if you will, at the Green's restaurant in San Francisco. There's a bunch of wine writers there, and we said, we're going to do this vineyard designate thing, grapes from one vineyard. And the wine writer said, you can't do that. It'll be too one-dimensional, just coming from one spot. And we didn't think that, but what we said is if we diversify, if we have multiple clones so that one vintner can pick 40% of clone A and 60% of clone B, and the next one 20% of clone A and 20% of B and 60% of C, they can add personality and complexity to their wines. So in all of these vineyards, we have planted a multiple of Cabernet clones. I think Coquelin has 6 different clones. It's a much bigger vineyard. This one has 2 or 3. But I can't tell you, I would assume that most of the wines you're drinking are a combination of both of those, because most of the guys buy from 2 blocks.
Yeah, I mean, I think most of the time when I taste with people, the idea is to have more than one block for that complexity. Yeah. And I mean, obviously, we can come back to this later, but obviously, I mean, you were spot on, because there's just been an explosion, a proliferation of single vineyard wines in Napa Valley since then.
You know, you go back, and I'll take you back into the 1980s, and Napa Valley was producing, most of the wines there were reserves. In other words, they were vineyard blends in the wineries, BV Private Reserve, Mondavi, whatever. And they were all blending to the same consumer profile. So the wine writers began to say that Napa Valley Cabernet is vanilla and chocolate, no personality. And we said, well, how do you do that? How do you change that? Well, our view, first of all, was that the quality came from the vineyard. And if we could show the terroir, so the qualities of the soil rather than the skill of the winemaker, we could improve the quality of Napa Valley Cabernet. And, you know, it sounded sort of revolutionary then, but I think that the Europeans have been doing it for 2,000 years, right? So we decided we would go vineyard designate. And what we did is that while Napa Valley produces a Bordeaux grape, up until about 2000, we marketed it as the Bordelais do. We did Chateau marketing, Chateau Lafite, Chateau Latour, Beaulieu Private Reserve. At that point, we shifted to a Burgundian way of marketing our fruit, and that was showing the different vineyards. And that was a sea change for the way Napa Valley presents itself to the world with their Cabernets. And I think it's proven very successful because you have so much complexity and diversity and uniqueness now. So that works, but it doesn't work unless you've got a great vineyard. So you got to start with a great vineyard, and our idea always was that if it's been producing the best of the red grapes that Napa Valley is producing in any time period, that gives you a pretty good indication of what it can do with our modern techniques in Cabernet Sauvignon. And that's why we went for the heritage vineyards.
Yeah, well, I have to tell you just looking at this one screenshot, I mean, I've just found it basically a lifetime's work to try to understand this much about what these places are about. I mean, just looking at, we'll get to Bourne in a second, but here's Dr. Crane, and here's Spotswood, and here's David Abreu's Capella, and here's Madrona Ranch. And these are just the better known vineyards. Ruston is making better and better wines. Gallica, which is rosemary cake bread. Edge Hill, which is Leslie Rudd. Marciano Vineyard, which is another historic vineyard that has been sort of reinvigorated. This whole sector here is, I think, fantastic. Llewellyn, White, Taplin. And I think it's for somebody
if you look right across the street from Dr. Crane is the elementary school.
Yes, exactly.
It's
on very expensive land.
And we tried our best to get them to put it somewhere else, and they wouldn't do it. But that's gorgeous vineyard land. But you also, what you can see here, there's a whole lot of houses in here. And that cuts down greatly on the ability to grow grapes in the towns.
Yeah, that's the high school. I mean, every time I park my car there, or I go take a picture of your vineyard, I'm like, wow, and here's the track.
Yeah. That's where the principal's office really is.
Yeah, okay. So that's here. And then the most recent one is this piece here, Beckstoffer Bourne, which is kind of related to, is part of this larger piece here, Hain. So what was the story around this piece? Because I think this is pretty special here.
William Bowers Bourne was what's called the last Bonanza King. He had the best gold mine in California and the best silver mine in Arizona. And he came here and he bought these vineyards. And his sister went up and married a prospector in Canada named William Alston Hayne I. So the Haynes are Bournes. And so this property, which was originally some 200 acres and had a big house on it called Madronia, which I forget, the Mazzonis own it now, family owns it now. But it got broken up, and most of it is Hayne. And I bought this vineyard from Audie Haynes' brother in 2003, I think, as a piece. It's a 13-acre vineyard. It's a small vineyard. It has, in my view, the best soils of all of our vineyards in Napa Valley. But again, it's the grape vineyard is a combination of soils and everything else. And as I said, grape vineyards, the total is more than the sum of the parts. You just can't look at the soils or the climate or any particular thing. You have to look at how they all interact, because so much is about timing, when it gets warm, when it gets cold, those kinds of things. But this vineyard has been just a great vineyard for us. It's one of the new ones.
So I have to ask, since you've said that this vineyard is possibly the best one that you have in Napa Valley, what
the soils?
Soil, yeah, the soils. So in your mind, what defines great soils for Napa Valley?
What defines great soils for Cabernet is well-drained soils, well-drained loamy soils. And this vineyard has a better combination of pebbles and rocks to soil than the other does. It has less rocks than Las Piedras. It has more rocks than Dr. Crane. And more rocks than Coquelin.
Okay, so it's all about balance of those different elements.
And ability to drain.
And drain, yeah.
And the soils are different too. If you go down, as you go down towards Coquelin and Oakville, you'll find there's more clay in the soils. As you come up here, you get less clay. But the important thing is that the first 24 inches of soil, which is where most of the roots grow. And that is more loamy here than it is down south, but the great water holding capacity.
Okay, so we're going to go to Oakville in a second, but I want to ask you one last thing, which you talked about. I said great soils. You corrected me, great soils for Cabernet, which is different.
Yeah.
Because this sector in particular, a bunch of these sectors, but this is an area, for example, where you still have head trained Zinfandel, some Petit Syrah. When you arrived in the late 60s, Napa Valley was not Cabernet heavy like it is now. That evolved over time. So what are your thoughts on more of a monoculture approach? Is it sort of specialization wins, or does it make you sad to see some diversity lost in the varieties? I mean, how do you think about that?
Antonio, you have to understand there's a lot of aspects to this business. One of them is business. So if you'll go into a supermarket or anywhere and look at the price of Cabernet versus the price of Zinfandel versus the price of Pinot Noir, you know what kind of business you want to be in. So if it will grow good Cabernet, you grow good Cabernet. And the thing is, the monoculture, as far as I'm concerned, it has a lot to do with disease protections and versatility. But anybody who in the Napa Valley who has great Cabernet land plants Cabernet. And when I came here, this was, and we've talked about this before, it was not wine country.
No.
In other words, we had no hospitality, anything of that sort. We had this saying, we said, never let the sun set on the tourists. Let them come up and taste the wine, but get them out of town before sunset, give them nowhere to eat and nowhere to sleep. Well, it wasn't wine country, but it also wasn't Cabernet country. You know, in 1970, the price of Cabernet was $500 a ton, but it's also the price of Pinot Noir, of Zinfandel, of Johannesburg Riesling, and Chardonnay. They're all the same, and there hadn't been, I think, there hadn't been any Cabernet planted for like 3 years in Napa Valley in 1970. So it clearly wasn't Cabernet country. We were fortunate because we came in with England and Beaulieu. But if you have great Cabernet soils here, you plant Cabernet. But in 1970, there were 4,500 tons. I've got some numbers here. 4,500 tons of Cabernet produced. There were over 5,000 tons of Petit Syrah produced. There was over 10,000 tons of Zinfandel produced and over 17,000 tons of Carignan produced. So we were producing red wines mostly, but we hadn't got into the Cabernet business, and the growers here wouldn't convert because they were low yielding. And in bad times, they paid the same thing. You know, in 1970, Gallo bought 50% of the grapes produced in Napa County. And he would buy from Hardy Burgundy, and he didn't care, Cabernet, Zinfandel, whatever you have, about the same price. So you produced what yields the best. But
yeah, just so you know, I'm not picking on you because this trend is not this is not or Napa Valley, not picking on Napa Valley, because this is a trend in other regions too, where if you go back 30 or 40 years, you had various crops that we were talking before we went on the air, we were talking about Piedmont, and this was the case in Piedmont too. In the 60s and the 70s, all the crops were more or less the same price. And then through a combination of economics and disease and wanting to plant more disease-resistant crops, you get to a setup now, which is, I don't know the exact numbers, but it's sort of like Napa Valley where you have one dominant variety. So I'm not picking on you. And I'm very well aware of how economics and the business work. It's just interesting to sort of think about, you know, the history and the linkages of places. I think it's important, you know.
It took us a while to get here. But I think now what you're seeing is that properly done Napa Valley Cabernet can compete with any red wines in the world. And so I think that's what we do.
Well, I don't think there's any question of that. Let's go to Oakville and take a look at Coquelin Vineyard, because that's one of your most famous pieces of land. I'm going to show you. So that's our oak. And yeah, so that's your piece is up here where my mouse is. So how did that come about?
Well, that was BV number 4. BV had 5 vineyards when we came here. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And number 1 was where the Depins lived. Number 2 was a little north of what is now Robert Mondavi. Number 3 is Vineyard George III of ours now. Number 4 was Coquelin. And number 5 was a spot in Canaris. And about 1993, the Hublin Corporation, and again, we're still in the age of the magic chef. Okay, the primary ingredient is the skill of the winemaker and his blending abilities. So Hublin felt like they had, what they said, for Inglenook and Beaulieu, they had 2,000 tons of Cabernet more than they needed. So they wanted to sell some Cabernet Sauvignon, plus phylloxera was hitting, and these vineyards needed to be replanted. So they wanted to sell some Cabernet Sauvignon. We had been farming this property. And so we said, well, sell us BV4. Now, Mondavi is right next door. And remember, that's another winery and got more money than we do. And Mondavi, again, who has this magic chef, Bob was a blender, they didn't want to pay. And we said, we'll pay. And we also had some contract rate pricing conflicts that we could resolve as part of this too. But that's how we got to buy it in 1993, because it needed replanting and the wineries wouldn't buy it. So they sold it to the poor little dumb farmer.
Neither poor nor dumb, but that's this piece of land here, 89 acres, correct?
That's right. It was 90 acres, but if you'll notice right up on the corner, there's a little spot. You have a dot on it.
Yeah.
And Otto Gramlow was when Hublin bought this from Ivan Schock in 1940, it was 90 acres. But the Madame Depin gave that 1 acre home site to her CFO, Otto Gramlow, and he built a house on it. So that's how it went from 90 acres to 89 acres.
So that's that vineyard. And
the important thing about this is that, you know, when Hamilton Crabb established Coquelin, he had 240 acres. And this is 90 or 89 acres of that original 240. You know, in all of this Coquelin conflict, we say Coquelin is land that was owned by and planted by Hamilton Crab.
To grapes.
Huh?
To grapes, correct?
To grapes.
Yeah, that's a big distinction.
To grapes. And it's not, I mean, some other people argue it's a trademark, but this is part of the original 240. He then bought another 117 across from it, and then another little bit up in the top where the McDonald's are. But that's what we say is Coquelin.
So before we get to a question that a bunch of people have asked, this is a Cliff Lady 2016 Coquelin Cabernet, which is showing really great. I don't know what you're drinking, but I don't think it's wine, but it's 5 o'clock here almost anyway. So I'm gonna have a glass or two or three. So for you, do you think Coquelin is a place or a trademark and a brand?
Well, it's a place. It's for sure a place. I mean, we can go back in history and show us a place back as far as you can go back. The first things were written about the Napa Valley. They wrote about Coquelin as a vineyard. So it's clearly a vineyard. And it's also trademarked. I mean, the Mondavi company got it through the trademark office. And as you know, that's a big dispute now. But it's clearly, in my view, it's a place.
So should it be a trademark?
Well, we sued them in 2004 to say it shouldn't be a trademark. We settled out of court, so they still have the trademark.
Yeah, you have a license to use the name, and it was the Schrader wine that created this whole controversy, as I recall.
Yes, yeah, because it was in those days it was going to be my fight, but the fight couldn't occur until somebody put it on a label. I could say it publicly all I wanted to, and I was, and they objected. But to really get into the court, somebody had to put it on the label. And so I asked several vintners, and basically, and I understand this completely, they don't want to get in a fight. Schrader said, sure, I'll do it. And so that's how it happened. And then we took over the fight.
And then it ended up settling, and you have a license to use it, but you're the only one, I think, who can do that, correct?
I think so.
Yeah. And so what about all of this? I mean, it's not on this map here, but now to the south, there's a whole new round of things with the vineyard house. I mean, how do you think about, how do you feel about that? What's your view on what Coquelin, what land?
That land was owned by the Coquelin Wine Company, but it was never planted to anything. And so basically they have taken our complaint and done it in their own name. And so they're fighting that fight again. But most of the things they said, we had said in 2004. Only thing was different was that we had land that was owned by and planted to grapes by Hamilton Crab, and they don't.
Yeah. So, I mean, well, we'll see where that goes. You know,
Yes.
As you probably know, I spend a lot of time in Napa Valley, and one of the peak times for being there for me is the harvest. Last year, in 2019, at almost every winery that I visited, a vineyard manager or a winer or a winemaker or a consultant was getting a call to buy fruit. And the calls were something like, pay whatever you can, just pay for the labor, just pick it, you know, because people are attached to vineyards and don't want to see the crop just sort of sit there. So obviously 2018, just the numbers I've seen from some people, up 30%, 2019, up 30%. What is the sort of state of the market right now, just pre-COVID, but I mean, just sort of what's the state of the market for premium grapes in Napa Valley from your vantage point?
From the vineyards, from the 6 heritage vineyards, there's a line. We don't need to sell. And we have had a little bit, but they have sold very well. For the rest of the grapes, there's a little bit of demand, but not very much. For vineyards in the Red Hills in Lake County and in Mendocino, it's pretty much dead. But what's happening is that because of the large crops in 2018 and 2019, we made a lot of bulk wine. We have the ability to do that, to take the perishability out of it, especially for Cabernet, because you can hold Cabernet in bulk for 2 years, so we can wait for the market to go away. And that market had been dead, but it's picking up. As you know, there's a great resurgence in wine sold off-premise and through e-commerce. And I think that a lot of the people who have traditionally been buyers of bulk wine, people like Kendall Jackson and the big guys, they were sellers. They're now buyers. So that market has changed. We've seen a change in that in the last month. Not what we like, but certainly a change.
Well, for sure, this is very good. I mean, I hate to say it, but these are favorable conditions for somebody who owns distribution and who can bottle a lot of bulk wine and sell it at a label that's recognized, because there's a lot.
Yes, and they can buy it at very good prices. It's time for someone to create new brand. This happened with the fighting varietals. It's happened every time. We're waiting for somebody to come through with distribution. The consumer should have a great opportunity to buy very nice wines at very inexpensive prices today.
Mm-hmm. So what does this year portend in your view?
It's pretty cool right now, but who knows? We won't know. It's just at 1st of April. So nobody knows anything. We didn't have a frost. The vines look great. We've had enough water to satisfy the wines at this point. They look great. But what's going to happen from now on, I don't know. We got to see what they set. We see how uniform veraison is, what sort of weather we get in August and September.
No, I know it's too soon to have an idea of the harvest, but I'm thinking the market. So I think about a small winery that in 2018 had a bumper crop. They bought all the fruit probably. Costs go up. You're thinking, I'm going to sell this wine in 2 years. Now it's time to bottle this wine, but you may not be able to sell all of that wine that you thought. And you also have 19. So it's like pretty complex if you're a small winery. And a lot of the most prestigious wines in Napa Valley are these 250, 300, 400 case productions, which I hope that they're profitable, because you always want to see rising tide lift all boats. But for small wineries that may have more volume that they really wanted, they thought they could sell it in 2020, but this market right now is pretty complex. So what happens?
And Tony, that's why I'm a simple grower and not in the winery business.
That's
too hard. That is just too hard for me.
Well, that was a question.
That's it. And somebody else is going to have to answer that question for you.
Well, I mean, I get asked all the time why I don't make wine. And one of the reasons is because you only have one chance to get it right. And I don't like my odds.
Well, I can tell you a lot of people are doing this kind of thing that you're doing. Different vintners are doing this. They're getting into e-commerce and finding other ways. And so there's some very inventive people out here. But it's clear that we're in some basically hard times. You know, this is a wonderful industry we're in that everything is cyclical. We have cycles in everything. And out here, we generally have a cycle of 8 or 9 years of good times. And then we have a cycle of 2 or 3 that are tough. And we generally go into the tough parts very precipitously, and we generally come out very precipitously. And hopefully that'll happen again. But it's a little different this time in that the consumer, when we went in, was one thing, and coming out is a little bit different, because the millenniums are a big part of coming out. They weren't a big part when we went in. So we're going to see how it happens again. But I would suggest to you that within a year or so, we will be out of this again. And then we should be in for another, if cycles hold, we'll be in for another long period. So it's still good times. But this is not what I've said. With people with strong brands and good management, will have a little pain, but they'll be fine. But we just have to go through it.
Well, I mean, if it's a year, that's a pretty optimistic view. I'm curious, since we're looking at the Coquelin map, is a question that we have from our audience. How would you compare the soils of Coquelin, your parcel, to say your St. Helena vineyards? What's the main difference?
There's a little more clay, and there's a little less rocks. And it's a little cooler there than it is in St. Helena.
Okay. But here in Beckstoffer Coquelin, you also have quite a mix of clones and now vine age, no?
Yes. Yeah. And what we've done something, again, new here, supposedly. In Napa Valley, generally, when you have a vineyard, you have different blocks: block A, block B, block C. And generally, when it came time, and the vineyards usually last 20 to 25 years, you pull that whole block out, because let's just say 30% of it is diseased or something's happened to it. And so we pulled a block out in 2018, and we changed the row direction, we changed the vine spacing, we changed the vineyard materials, and we thought that in that way we could improve the quality of the fruit we produced. But we began to think about that, and we said, wait a minute, we have just pulled out 70% good vines. And we believe that that mature root structure may give us better quality than young root structure. In other words, rather than pulling everything out at 25 years, we could have vines that were 30 years old and maybe 40 years old. So we've gone to a rogue and replant idea. So we went into the next block, the rest of the blocks at Coquelin, and we pulled out all the diseased vines or underproducing vines, and we put in new vines. And we didn't pull out that 70% plus of good vines. Now, that's not quite as easy as you think, because we have important shading problems. The old vines shading the new vines. We have irrigation problems. We'll have harvest problems. We don't know all the problems we'll have. But it seems to us that we could improve quality if we could begin to produce, if we could keep these vines and produce vines that had these more mature root systems, 30-year vine, a 40-year-old vine. So we've changed the replanting program now in all of our premium vineyards, but we'll see how it goes.
I think it's really important because one of the things about Napa Valley is that the average vine age is actually pretty young.
Right.
And there is also, relative to other parts of the world, in my opinion anyway, less of a tolerance for underperforming blocks. You know, you go see somebody and they plant something, and then 3 or 4 years later, if it's not doing what somebody wants, they just rip it out, which you don't see in Europe as much. You see much more, you know, a much more patient, not patient, but I think people have a wider tolerance for things that aren't perfect. So it's great to see greater vine age. I'm going to give you a break and answer a question that Benoit Touquet asked me, because I think he wants to get me shot. But he asked me if I would classify your vineyards as Grand Cru. So when I started doing the maps, you know, some people were kind of had some objections. And I think people thought we would try to rank these vineyards. And that was never part of the plan. Because I think we don't know, for one thing, I think we're just all learning. This whole concept of single vineyards here, as you've really demonstrated and explained, is very young. But more than that, to me, but my answer is, to me, what makes a vineyard Grand Cru is that the vineyard can make a great wine in almost every year. And I think in this tenderloin of Napa Valley, there's a lot of vineyards like that. It's incredible privilege, you know, to be able to taste hundreds of wines from all these producers each and every year from all these different blocks, and to have people say, this is, you know, the barrel samples, that's this block. There's a lot of places where I go and taste all sorts of wines that never anybody ever sees, because they all end up being, you know, blended. So this clone, that block, whatever. And there's a lot of vineyards in these maps that we've shown of places that, in my view, make consistent wine each and every year. And so that's kind of what for those who are wondering, that's sort of what I'm looking for if I were to think about some sort of hierarchy, is that the wines are consistent. They have a personality that's identifiable each and every year. You mentioned the Burgundian model. So if you take a great vineyard like a Musigny or a Bon Mar, each year those wines have a certain personality. Sure, great vintages are great and challenging vintages are challenging, but the personality of the vineyard really comes through. But I want to ask you one question that Kevin asked, which is, I mean, you've had this very long and illustrious career, but if there's anything that you would change or do differently, what would it be?
I'd buy more vineyard. Where? Oh, I could show you, you know, in the 50 years, I've seen most everything here sell once a night. But, you know, you could know where they are. They would be in the St. Helena, Rutherford, Oakville area, Cabernet. Yeah. So
what's one that you know, sometimes you hear these movie stars, they say, oh, you know, I turned down that role, you know, so like 20 years later, they'll say, I turned down this role. So what's one that you might have, you wished, I wish I would have bought that. I had a chance.
Vineyard in front of Inglenook. I could have bought that. When Hublin sold that to Canandaigua and their Constellation had no interest in the winery and had no interest in the vineyard. They kept the winery for a while and finally sold it to Francis Ford Coppola. And then they kept the vineyard for a while, weren't interested, and then they sold that. But I had a chance to buy that back, I forget, it was 1990, something like that. But it was one of those years where I was afraid that the banks would finally catch up with me and say, this guy's too aggressive.
So you mean, so here's Inglenook. So you mean where exactly? Inglenook is here.
Right in front of it's 90 acres right in front of the vineyard, right in front of the winery.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Right there. And it was for sale. And it's one of the great vineyards in the Napa Valley, $9 million. And I just didn't have the money and didn't think I could go for it at that point.
That's a fascinating story.
Yeah, that's one. And there's a few more there, but that's the big one. That's the big one.
And is there anywhere in Napa Valley that it's more of a broader question, but you've talked about that sort of tenderloin. You've got Rutherford, Oakville, St. Helena. Is there any place in Napa Valley more broadly that is attractive as a place?
No, not for me, not for Cabernet Sauvignon. Now, we grow a good bit of Merlot and Pinot Noir, and Chardonnay and Canaris, and we're very happy with that. It gives us diversification. And we grow Merlot in the Oak Knoll district, which is south of here.
Yeah.
That would probably be more attractive for me, more Merlot in the Oak Knoll district than anything else. But if we do any expansion again, and I don't know that we will, because most of these great vineyards are in strong hands, or they have a big house or a winery on. And so for a guy in production agriculture, it's hard to pay $8 million for a house or buy a winery with it. And so that I'm not sure how much further we can go in the Napa Valley. We're very excited about what's happening in the Red Hills and Lake County. It'll be a different thing, but it'll be totally premium North Coast Cabernet, if you would. And we can sell it at a much better price. So you can sell it. You can have a $60 bottle of wine, a $70 bottle of wine, a really great Cabernet.
That's where you gave winemakers a chance to get the fruit for 3 years and make a wine, right?
That's correct. And that was a research project, and it turned out very well. Now, we didn't get as many wines produced because the fires happened. All of those wineries, every winemaker in that had made $150 Cabernet, so they had another job. And so when you had the fires happening, and then once they got the wine, they figured out, I'm going to have to sell it. And they really didn't want to do that. But we have one wine that we show that we really like, Keith Emerson's wine. But the research project really worked. Yeah.
So going back to like your core vineyards, your 6 heritage vineyards, obviously everybody wants that fruit. So how do you, obviously there's a price and a formula for that, but how do you decide how you're going to allocate that fruit? Is it?
The first thing we look at is who's the winemaker. Remember what I said, that great vineyards are places where you make great wine. So the first thing we want to know is who's the winemaker. And it can be an established winemaker or a winemaker that we're seeing great promise with. And secondly, if he's not the owner, we want an owner who understands what this business is about. It's a very expensive business, a very premium business. And so he's got to be able to market it properly. There's no point in having a $150 bottle of, and the pricing and all figures this in, $150 bottle of Cabernet somebody sells for $60 because they don't understand the business and the quality and the uniqueness of these vineyards. So first cut is the winemaker. Secondly is the owner of the management business.
Okay, so obviously that's really important in a time like this. So as you look out, you've seen this incredible span of time, 1960s to present. You're looking, what's the future?
Well, it's very bright and very different. The thing is that we have gotten to where we are on the back of technology. We're doing this COVID-19 thing right now, and it will be over, and then we'll be seriously in the climate change business and what's happening. And in the past, we have succeeded in the adversity with technology. We will do that again. So we're running, I think we're running this big research project up in the Red Hills with the University of California, Davis. It's an expensive project with 10 different clones and 10 different rootstocks and all the permutations and combinations. Now, they're intended to look at climate change and drought resistance and things, but they're also looking at the increase in wine quality. what we're doing at Coquelin with our rogue and replant, then we think we can improve the quality of their wines. So we are sort of now, especially in Napa Valley, really not in the business of expanding our holdings. We're in the business of improving the quality of our holdings. And I think we can do that. I seriously think we can do that.
Are you talking about the Napa Valley, or are you talking about your own company?
Well, I'm talking about I think Napa Valley. I think Napa Valley can do it because we're all into this and we're all understanding that's where we have to go. I mean, I think I've said to you before, I think in Great Wine Region, the wines from Great Wine Region have to, one, stand the test of time, and two, complement and not compete with food. And I think in the Napa Valley, we probably can do more to complement food with our Cabernets and stop competing with them so much. And I think we can improve that. I think we can get those wines that are just as wonderful, but they don't compete with food so much. They complement it more than compete with it and stand the test of time.
That would probably make them sell more too, because you don't have that conflict. But that, I think, is a conversation for a whole other day. Andy, thanks so much for your time. It's been a real pleasure, a real honor to talk to you. It's always a pleasure to stop by your office and bug you for maps and advice and history and all that. And you're an encyclopedia of knowledge. So thank you. We had a ton of questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all, but thanks everyone for watching. Andy, thanks for your time, and best of luck with the rest of 2020.
Thank you, Antonio. Stay safe.
Same.